George Washington, the Commander-in-Chief. Picture the early summer of 1775. The smell of gunpowder still hung over the small Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord, where the first shots of rebellion had already echoed across the colonies. The air was thick with uncertainty and fear, but also with something entirely new, hope. 13 colonies, once loyal to the British Crown, now stood on the edge of revolution. But who could possibly lead them? Who could unite farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, and scholars into an army strong enough to stand against the world's greatest military power? All eyes turned toward one man, a tall, broad-shouldered Virginian with a quiet, commanding presence. His name was George Washington. Before he became the face of the American Revolution, Washington was already a figure of admiration throughout the colonies. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Born in 1732 on a modest plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia, Washington had grown up in the shadow of the British Empire. His early life was one of ambition, discipline, and self-control. He was not born into great wealth, nor did he possess the formal education of Europe's elite. What he had instead was character, an unshakable sense of duty, a belief in honor, and an almost obsessive desire to earn respect through service. As a young man, he became a surveyor, trekking through the untamed wilderness of the Virginia frontier. That experience shaped him. The forests and rivers taught him patience. The endless, raw expanse of America taught him humility. But soon, destiny called him to war. During the French and Indian War, the young Washington served bravely under the British flag. He learned the chaos of battle, the pain of defeat, and the cost of leadership. At Fort Necessity, he suffered a humiliating loss. Yet it was there, amid mud and blood, that he discovered something vital. Leadership wasn't about never failing, it was about enduring failure and standing up stronger each time. When the war ended, Washington returned home to Mount Vernon, the plantation he would one day make famous. He married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow, and tried to settle into the life of a gentleman farmer. But something in him remained restless. The empire he had once served now seemed to tighten its grip on the colonies, squeezing them with taxes and laws passed from across the ocean. By 1775, colonial anger had reached a breaking point. The Boston Tea Party had defied royal authority, and in response, Britain sent troops to enforce order. When those troops fired on colonial militia at Lexington and Concord, rebellion became reality. As the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia to decide what to do next, delegates from across the colonies looked for someone who could unite them. They needed not just a soldier, but a symbol. Someone who could bridge the gap between the fiery radicals of New England and the cautious moderates of the South. Enter George Washington. He didn't seek power. In fact, he seemed to avoid it. But when he arrived in Congress wearing his old military uniform, the gesture spoke louder than words. It was a silent declaration, he was ready to serve. John Adams, recognizing Washington's calm authority, nominated him to lead the newly formed Continental Army. The decision was unanimous. And so, on June 15, 1775, George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief. It was a moment that would change history. When Washington accepted the command, he did so with humility. In his speech before Congress, he said, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." Those weren't empty words. He truly doubted whether he was the right man for the job. But Washington also understood something deeper, that leadership wasn't about confidence in oneself, but faith in the cause. He refused a salary, asking only to have his expenses reimbursed. It was a powerful statement. He wasn't fighting for money or fame. He was fighting for principle. For liberty. Before leaving Philadelphia, he wrote a farewell letter to his wife, Martha. It was short, but full of emotion. He confessed he didn't know if he'd ever see her again. Then he mounted his horse and began the long journey north to Massachusetts, where the makeshift army waited for him. When Washington arrived in Cambridge in July 1775, he faced a sight that would have broken a lesser man's spirit. Before him stood the Continental Army, a loose collection of poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly disciplined men. Some carried hunting rifles instead of muskets, others had no weapons at all. Their clothes were tattered, their morale uncertain, and their loyalties divided among the colonies they came from. But Washington saw more than chaos. He saw potential. He understood that if America was to stand a chance, this ragtag militia had to become a real army. And that transformation began with discipline. Washington imposed strict drills, regular training, and an unyielding chain of command. It was unpopular at first, many militiamen bristled at his authority, but slowly, order began to take shape. He walked among his men, spoke with them, and shared their hardships. He was not a distant commander issuing orders from comfort. He stood beside them in the mud, the cold, the hunger. And because of that, they followed him not out of fear, but respect. The British Army, led by General Thomas Gage, had fortified Boston after the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. Washington's first major task as commander was to surround the city and trap the British within. But it wasn't easy. The Continental Army lacked ammunition, cannons, and even gunpowder. Washington's letters to Congress became desperate pleas for supplies. He was learning quickly that he wasn't just fighting a military battle, he was leading a revolution with no money, no resources, and no guarantee of support. Still, he refused to give up. Using what he had, he built fortifications, trained his troops, and waited for an opportunity. That opportunity came in early 1776, thanks to an unlikely hero, Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller turned artillery expert. Knox led a daring winter expedition to haul captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga through snow and mountains to Boston. When the guns finally arrived, Washington moved swiftly. On the night of March 4, 1776, under the cover of darkness, Washington's men occupied the high ground at Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. By morning, British General William Howe awoke to find American cannons aimed directly at the city. Realizing his position was untenable, Howe ordered a retreat. On March 17, the British Army and thousands of Loyalists sailed away from Boston, one of the first great American victories of the war. The city was free, and the colonies erupted in celebration. But Washington didn't celebrate for long. He knew this was only the beginning. The British Empire would not surrender so easily. Through those early months, Washington's leadership became clear. He was calm under pressure, tireless in adversity, and humble in triumph. He never allowed success to inflate his ego nor defeat to crush his resolve. He was, above all, steady, and in times of chaos, steadiness was a rare gift. His men began to see him not as a distant officer but as the embodiment of their cause. To them, he wasn't just fighting the British, he was fighting for the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves. The revolution had its leader. And though the road ahead would bring unimaginable hardship, defeats, betrayals, and bitter winters, Washington's sense of duty would never waver. He would hold the army together through sheer willpower. He would transform rebellion into a nation. But before America could be born, the commander-in-chief would have to face his greatest tests, on the battlefields of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, where the dream of independence would hang by a thread. Part 2, The Winter of Despair and the Turning Tide. The year was 1776. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry, and yet the young American cause was already teetering on the edge of destruction. George Washington, now the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, stood at the center of it all, weary, resolute, and burdened with the fate of a nation that did not yet exist. The euphoria of Boston's liberation had faded. The British, humiliated but not defeated, were regrouping. And soon, they would strike with a force that would shake the colonies to their core. In the summer of 1776, British warships began to fill New York Harbor. Their numbers were staggering. It was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled, nearly 32,000 soldiers, supported by a powerful navy that ruled the seas. New York City, with its strategic harbor and central location, was the next British target. Washington knew it. He rushed his army south to defend it, even though his men were outnumbered, under-equipped, and untested in large-scale battle. Standing on Manhattan's bluffs, Washington looked out over the fleet. Ship after ship, stretching as far as the eye could see. One of his officers muttered, "Good God, General, what a sight." Washington, his face calm but grave, replied, "Yes. And it is a sight that might strike terror into any but the stoutest hearts." In August 1776, the British struck. General William Howe led a perfectly executed assault on Long Island. Washington's army, inexperienced and scattered, was quickly overwhelmed. The British flanked them, and chaos followed. The battle was a catastrophe. Thousands of American soldiers were killed, captured, or scattered. For a moment, it seemed the rebellion might end right there, crushed in the mud of Brooklyn. But Washington refused to let it happen. Under the cover of night and heavy fog, he orchestrated one of the most daring retreats in military history. Using every available boat, he silently ferried his entire army, nearly 9,000 men, across the East River to Manhattan. When dawn broke, the British advanced only to find the Americans gone. It was a miracle of timing and luck, and it saved the revolution. Yet the victories did not follow. Over the next few months, Washington's army was relentlessly pursued. From Manhattan to White Plains, from Fort Washington to New Jersey, the Americans were driven back again and again. Morale plummeted. Supplies ran out. Men deserted. Some called Washington incompetent, others whispered that the revolution was doomed. By December, what remained of the Continental Army, fewer than 3,000 half-starved, barefoot men, staggered across the icy Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Behind them, the British believed the war was effectively over. In London, newspapers declared the rebellion in its last gasp. Even in the colonies, faith wavered. The dream of liberty seemed to be slipping away. But Washington did not yield. On the night of December 24, 1776, as snow and freezing rain lashed the riverbanks, Washington gathered his officers. His face was pale from exhaustion, but his voice was steady. Victory or death, he told them, the password for the operation to come. For days, he had studied the situation. The British Army had established winter quarters in New Jersey, confident the fighting was done until spring. Among them were German mercenaries known as Hessians, stationed in the small town of Trenton. Washington saw his chance. He would strike a surprise blow. It was desperate, even reckless, but so was the situation. That Christmas night, as most of the world celebrated in warmth and light, Washington's army began one of the most legendary marches in American history. They crossed the icy Delaware River in the dark, with the wind howling and sheets of ice crashing against the boats. Men wrapped rags around their feet to keep from freezing. Some fell into the water and died from the cold before reaching the opposite shore. Yet somehow, they made it across. At dawn on December 26, Washington's army descended upon Trenton. The Hessians, still groggy from their holiday celebrations, were caught completely by surprise. For the first time in months, the Americans fought with fire in their eyes. Muskets blazed, drums beat through the smoke, and Washington rode among his men shouting encouragement. His tall figure on horseback, calm and commanding amid the chaos, became a living symbol of defiance. In less than an hour, it was over. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. American casualties were minimal. When the smoke cleared, Washington's army had achieved what no one thought possible, a decisive victory at the very moment all hope seemed lost. News of Trenton electrified the colonies. The people's faith returned, and the revolution was reborn. A few days later, the American pamphleteer Thomas Paine published his immortal words. "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now, deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Those words captured what Washington's men had endured, the hunger, the cold, the fear, and what they had overcome through sheer will. Washington wasn't just fighting battles, he was shaping the spirit of a nation. Washington wasn't finished. Knowing the British would strike back, he planned another daring move. On the night of January 2, 1777, after skirmishing near Trenton, he secretly led his army on a midnight march around the enemy's flank toward Princeton. At dawn, his troops clashed with British regulars outside the town. For a moment, the American lines faltered, but then Washington rode straight into the line of fire, rallying his men. "Parade with me, my brave fellows," he shouted. Musket balls whistled around him, but none struck. His courage transformed panic into victory. The British retreated, and the Americans captured Princeton. In less than 10 days, Washington had turned total defeat into triumph. For the first time, the revolution seemed possible again. After Princeton, Washington's legend began to grow. To the world, he seemed almost superhuman, a man who could turn disaster into victory, who never showed fear, who always carried himself with grace and dignity. But inside, he was human, exhausted, often uncertain, sometimes despairing. He wrote to Congress pleading for supplies, for money, for reinforcements. He confided in friends about the crushing weight of command. He knew that every decision he made could mean the life or death of the revolution itself. Still, he never allowed doubt to show in front of his men. He understood that his greatest weapon wasn't his sword, but his example. His calm steadiness kept the army together when everything else seemed to fall apart. By the spring of 1777, the Continental Army was no longer a band of frightened farmers. They were soldiers, hardened by defeat, inspired by victory, and united by belief in their leader. Washington had given them something far more powerful than weapons or supplies. He had given them faith, faith in themselves, and faith that freedom was worth any price. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay some of the darkest and bloodiest years of the struggle, battles that would test Washington's endurance, challenge his leadership, and threaten to tear the revolution apart from within. From the forests of Pennsylvania to the frozen huts of Valley Forge, Washington would face hunger, mutiny, and despair. He would be betrayed by politicians, doubted by allies, and hunted by the world's strongest army. And yet, through it all, he would remain unbroken. Because George Washington wasn't merely leading a war. He was forging the soul of a nation. Part 3, The Trials of Valley Forge and the Birth of a Nation. Winter came early in 1777. The land was cold, gray, and silent, as if the whole continent were holding its breath. After years of struggle, the American Revolution hung in fragile balance. George Washington's army had survived battles, hunger, and despair, but now it faced its greatest enemy yet, the winter at Valley Forge. The year had not been kind to the Continental Army. After the victories at Trenton and Princeton, Washington's fortunes shifted once again. In September 1777, the British launched a massive campaign to capture Philadelphia, the heart of the Revolution, the city where independence had been declared. Washington tried desperately to defend it. At Brandywine Creek, he met General Howe's army in battle. The Americans fought bravely, but the British flanked them once again, and the day ended in defeat. A month later, Washington's men clashed with the British at Germantown, another loss, though one that showed America's growing discipline and courage. By October, Philadelphia had fallen. Congress fled to York, Pennsylvania. Many whispered that the rebellion might not last another year. Washington refused to give up. He led his weary army westward to a defensible position for the winter, a small, windswept plateau about 20 miles from Philadelphia. The place was called Valley Forge. When the soldiers arrived in December 1777, the snow was already deep. Food was scarce. Shoes were nearly non-existent. Many wrapped their feet in rags or went barefoot on the frozen ground, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. There were no proper barracks at first, only tents battered by icy winds. The men began to build log huts with whatever tools they could find, chopping trees until their hands bled. By January, thousands were sick with fever, dysentery, and pneumonia. The stench of illness hung over the camp. Nearly 2,000 soldiers would die before spring came. But through all of it, Washington stayed. He refused the comfort of warm lodgings, choosing instead to share the same conditions as his men. Every morning, he rode through the camp, his horse kicking up snow as he passed ragged lines of soldiers. He spoke to them softly, offered encouragement, and listened to their grievances. He became, in those months, not just their commander, but their father. One of his aides later wrote, "He seemed to suffer with them, and to have taken upon himself all their distress." Washington's challenges weren't only on the battlefield. Inside Congress, some politicians were growing impatient. A few began to question his leadership, even whispering about replacing him with another general. It was known as the Conway Cabal, a quiet plot to undermine Washington's command. When he learned of it, Washington didn't rage or retaliate. He simply continued his work. His dignity and calm silence spoke louder than any accusation. By the time spring came, the plot had collapsed under the weight of his integrity. Even his critics couldn't deny it, George Washington was the backbone of the revolution. In February 1778, a new figure arrived at Valley Forge, a former Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben. He was brash, loud, and colorful, with a thick accent and a temper that could rattle mountains. But Washington immediately recognized his value. Von Steuben had come to train the Continental Army in the ways of professional European warfare. At first, the soldiers mocked his strange mannerisms and constant shouting, until they realized he was transforming them into a true fighting force. Day after day, he drilled them in formation, discipline, and precision. Under Washington's watchful eye, the ragged army of farmers began to move like soldiers, marching in unison, loading and firing faster, learning to fight as one. By spring, the transformation was astonishing. Washington had not only kept the army alive, he had forged it into something new. Something powerful. There is a story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, of a cold day at Valley Forge when a Quaker farmer named Isaac Potts came upon Washington alone in the woods, kneeling in the snow and praying. The general's voice was trembling, his eyes closed, his hands clasped in desperation. The farmer later said, "I heard the voice of that man pleading with God, and I knew then that the cause of liberty would prevail." Whether the story happened exactly that way or not, it captured the essence of Washington's leadership. He was a man of deep humility, one who sought guidance not in pride or politics, but in faith and endurance. As spring warmed the valley, new hope arrived. The news spread through camp like wildfire. France had officially allied with the United States. The victory at Saratoga the previous year had convinced King Louis XVI that America could win. Now, French ships and soldiers would soon join the fight. The tide of the war was turning. When Washington marched his army out of Valley Forge in June 1778, they were unrecognizable, no longer the desperate, starving men of the winter, but a disciplined, confident army ready to face the British once more. At the Battle of Monmouth, they proved it. Under scorching heat, Washington led his troops against General Howe's forces in New Jersey. When an inexperienced subordinate faltered, Washington galloped to the front, rallying his men with thunderous determination. "Stand fast, my boys," he shouted as bullets whizzed around him. "Stand fast." The Americans held their ground. The battle ended in a draw, but for Washington and his army, it was a moral victory. The soldiers who had once fled from battle now stood firm against the might of Britain. The war would continue for years, through triumphs and hardships. But the core of the American army, its discipline, courage, and unity, had been forged forever in the frozen crucible of Valley Forge. As years passed, Washington's leadership never wavered. He endured betrayals, political strife, and the endless grind of war. He faced defeat at times, but he always returned stronger. He learned the art of patience, knowing when to fight, and when to wait. He learned to trust the courage of his men and the justice of their cause. Finally, in 1781, that patience paid off. In a daring move, Washington marched his army south to Virginia, where British General Cornwallis had dug in at Yorktown. With French troops under Rochambeau and a French fleet blocking the harbor, Washington surrounded the British. The siege lasted weeks. Cannon fire thundered day and night. And then, on October 19, 1781, the impossible happened: Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. As the British troops marched out to lay down their arms, Washington watched in silence. There was no triumphal shout, no gloating, no celebration. Only solemn pride. He knew what it had cost to reach that day: the blood, the hunger, the years of sacrifice. The United States of America had been born. But Washington's greatness was not only in victory. It was in what he did next. When the war ended, the Continental Congress offered him power. Many expected him to seize it, to become a king in all but name. But Washington stunned the world by doing the unthinkable: he resigned. On December 23, 1783, in Annapolis, Maryland, he stood before Congress and said, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action." He returned to Mount Vernon, longing for nothing more than peace and home. Across the ocean, King George III was said to have remarked, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And he did. Of course, history was not finished with George Washington. In a few short years, his country would call him again, this time not to lead an army, but a nation. He would become the first president of the United States, shaping the very soul of the republic he had helped to create. But the man who led at Valley Forge, who crossed the Delaware, who turned despair into destiny, that man was forever the heart of the revolution. Washington's true victory was not in battles won, but in the example he set, of honor over ambition, of humility over pride, and of service over power. He showed that leadership was not about commanding men, it was about inspiring them. He showed that a single person, driven by conviction and duty, could help birth a nation built on freedom. And long after the snow of Valley Forge had melted, long after the guns of Yorktown had fallen silent, the image of George Washington, standing tall, calm, and steadfast amid the storm, would remain forever engraved in the American heart. The end. Thank you for traveling with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support is important to us.